time to start, so we'll get started. Hope everybody had a good weekend. Ready to face the next week of the semester? Enthusiasm. Yeah, right. Okay. Two quick announcements you should have in your email boxes somewhere if you haven't downloaded them already. Study guide for the first exam, which is a week from this coming Friday, coming soon. Study guide for that, as well as the stuff that I'm going to be projecting out here. If you don't have it, double check. Let me know. Nobody's email is bounced back. So from my end, it went through. Other thing is, maybe by Wednesday, but by the end of the week for sure, I will have made assignments for which seminar day you're going to be working at. Divide you up for the 5 different seminar days. Once I divide you up, if it turns I have a schedule conflict or something, a big project or test due in other classes that day, we can switch with somebody. But for now, I just want us to get organized that way. Okay? So that'll be coming soon. All right, I'm going to take the role in an eccentric way today. I'm going to ask you for the next 2 or 3 weeks to sit where you're sitting now. That'll help me put names and faces together, okay? So if you need to look around you, make sure you can stand sitting next to the person that you're next to. And I'll turn my back up close, count to 15. We can do Chinese fire drill if we need to. But if you will be sure to remember where you're sitting, okay? This will help me out a whole lot. Also, anything else you can do to help me remember your name. Pop by the office. If I'm in there, stick your head in and say, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm in your 11 o'clock class. You see me walking across campus, throw a book at me or shoe or something to get my attention. Say, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm in your 11 o'clock class. Eventually it will sink through this big skull, okay? All right. Anyway, what I want to do is take roll. I'm going to let you tell me who you are, and I'm going to write your name on my little piece of paper here, okay? So tell me your first name and your last initial, and we'll just work our way down and up and back, okay?
All right. My name's Melissa, last initial is H.
Okay.
Marcus S.
Okay.
Davis G.
Okay.
Ahel L.
I'll go back and correct all my spelling and stuff later on.
Kennedy W.
Okay.
Eliza H. Andy C.
This is also a chance for y'all to get to know who's who too.
Logan C. Ty M.
Okay.
Alexa M. Amber G.
Jake K.
Christy T. JCR. Rajul P. Julia P.
Wearing a Kentucky shirt. His class. You should be in Dr. Nash's class. We have a fun time during the spring semester when Duke and Kentucky are usually very on. Yeah.
Sarah R.
Will G.
Jade T.
I'm sorry.
Jade T. Rebecca B.
Okay.
Michaela L.
Anya G. Michaela B.
Shelby S.
Kayla A.
Okay.
Emma S.
Including sound effects.
Cassie M.
Ellie C. Ellie C.
And Cameron F.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Again, remember where you're seating. That will Okay, any questions about what we did last time, talked about last time? Lingering questions? Not lingering questions. Okay. A text without a context is what?
A pretext.
All right, so last time we talked about our contemporary context and how that influences the attitudes that we bring to these texts when we read them, when we talk about them. Some of us may think that they are divine products and they're authoritative because God said it and they're supposed to be interpreted literally. That may be where we're starting from. Other people are going to say, well, I think it's an important book, but I don't know quite how to describe its importance. You know, it's sort of like Shakespeare or Aristotle or whatever. Maybe it's just a bunch of historical interest, or maybe it's just wild superstition. Who knows? But we all come to this set of literature with our own ideas and understanding that and trying to bracket those as much we can is a good thing to know. So that's what last session was in many ways about, trying to put where we may be coming from into a broader scope of debates today. We're moving from the present today into the past, and we're trying to put the New Testament texts in their historical context. They were written at particular points in time for particular people experiencing life in particular ways. And so what I want to do today is kind of give some broad strokes for that. And to do that, we'll distinguish between two primary contexts, the Roman context and the Jewish context. We will not get all the way through this today. That's okay. These first few class sessions leading up to the first test, we'll get done what we need to do by the first test, but we won't necessarily stay completely on target. But if you stay ahead or stay with the reading in the syllabus, even if we're lagging a little bit behind in class, we'll be good, okay? So just read as if we're on schedule, and we will get back on schedule by hook or by crook. Okay, so the Roman context, lots of different things to think about the Greco-Roman world. As far as Jewish history is concerned, it begins with the conquest when General Pompey invades this portion of the Middle East in 63 BCE and establishes Roman rule over this part of the world. The Roman Empire has now expanded. The last vestiges of the Greek Empire from Alexander the Great and the successor generals of that has now fallen to Rome. Pompey establishes Roman rule in 63 BCE. And ancient Israel is now made up of 3 Roman provinces. You don't have a map in the Access Bible. You don't have a map in this Bible. But something like this. That's not how you spell Mediterranean, but that's how I'm going to spell it right now. Whatever my spelling is on the board is not gospel, so always double check. Anyway, pretend that's the Mediterranean Sea. And this is the Sea of Galilee up here, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea down here. We've got basically 3 Roman provinces. There's Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. Jerusalem is down here, Nazareth is up there, Bethlehem is down here. But what had been centuries before, the nation of Israel is now divided and known by these province names, the Roman provinces of Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. And these provinces are governed at different points in time by a couple of different classes of leaders. There are tetrarchs, like Herod the Great, who ruled at least Judea during 47 through 4 BCE. And then a Roman appointed governor, procurator, for example, Pilate, 26 to 36 CE. Are y'all familiar with the distinction between CE and BCE? What that refers to? Okay, I see a few people looking confused. BCE and CE are the standard scholarly conventions for dating and have been for years. BCE stands for before the Common Era, CE stands for the Common Era. BCE, as far as the calendar is concerned, is the same thing as BC. CE is the same thing as AD, but it's a religiously neutral way of dividing up the calendar. BC stands for before Christ. AD stands for Anno Domini, the Latin Year of our Lord. It's just a religiously neutral way of setting up the calendar.
Do you have a problem with us saying the religiously not neutral?
I don't, although I'd like you to become in an academic classroom familiar with the convention. And this happened, I don't know how long ago this happened, I should look it up sometime. But it's way before anybody ever started talking about political correctness. Okay, so don't blame it on anything like that. This is how this region of the world was governed. Herod the Great ruled at the time Jesus was born. Pilate ruled at the time Jesus died. See who's paying attention here. If Herod the Great ruled when Jesus was born, what seems odd about this dating?
But he died 4 years before Jesus was born.
Yeah. Yeah. And it has to do with shifts from different calendars and losing years and all of there. But yeah, and we'll get to this when we get to the historical Jesus. But Jesus was born on our calendar somewhere between 4 and 6 BCE, more than likely, as best we can date. So Jesus was born before he was born, according to the calendar. You've read a little bit, I hope, in the background readings out of J&T, a little bit about Herod and Pilate. Part of the readings for today are intended to supplement, fill in some of the details that we're not going to talk about in class. But you know, Herod is, in the words of my mother-in-law, who was born in Atlanta and still has not forgiven Sherman for burning Atlanta. She's too much of a polite Baptist to say damn Yankee, but when she says Yankee, you know she's thinking damn Yankee. I actually got her to admit it over the summer. Herod the Great, neither Herod nor Pilate were, in her way of characterizing, neither one of them were very nice men. Herod was known for his ruthlessness. Whether or not he actually had all the 2-year-old male children killed around the time Jesus was born, whether that's something that serves other purposes in Matthew's gospel, it's certainly in character of Herod to do stuff like that, from what we know from other historical sources. Ruthless, brutal, also known for his building programs, his building projects. For our purposes, we would associate him most with the temple in Jerusalem. He is the one who took what was in many ways a pretty pitiful bit of a building and expanded it into one of the most massive and impressive buildings in the ancient world. It was that heart of the world. If you've ever heard of the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, that's the last standing bit of the temple that Herod expanded. Butted right up against the Roman fortress, the Antonia. It was, we'll talk more about that when we get there. Ruthless, great building projects, egotistical, and again in the J&T article you can learn more about how this half-Jewish person ended up being sort of a puppet ruler for Rome during this period of time. It's a story, the details of the story are worth any soap opera. They really are. Again, Roman procurators, Pilate. Pilate really didn't care to be in Jerusalem or in Judea. He couldn't care less from historical records about crucifying Jews. Anytime you look sideways at him, crucifying him. Pretty brutal person by all accounts. Perhaps arguably too brutal even for Rome, because he's called back to Rome after 7 years in charge. And nobody hears from him since. Maybe he's too brutal for him, which is pretty brutal, as we'll talk about. This is the basic governing structure. Questions or comments so far? There are some positives in the Greco-Roman world. There's the Peace of Rome. there's a downside to the peace of Rome, but you know, the idea that the Mediterranean world is largely living at peace with one another. The Roman Empire has brought some semblance of order to this part of the world. We will talk more about the price that was paid for that peace in a moment. Roman technology, right, aqueducts, those sorts of things. The roads, especially, the Roman roads were especially important for the development and the spread of early Christianity, as it allowed people like Paul and other leaders in the early church to travel, again, relatively easily from one portion of the Roman Empire to another. The rule of law. Rome at least pretended to be, the Roman Empire pretended to be an empire ruled by law. Of course, there were always exceptions to law, and the rule of the law was pretty abusive, but that's one of the things that at least we in the West want to kind of valorize about is the Roman law. Our modern jurisprudence system is in many ways inspired by Rome. Again, it's not necessarily what Rome did, but it's one of the ideals that we often, positives that we often associate with Roman rule. Again, I think it's not inaccurate as long as, again, we take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. It was a tolerant empire within limits. And the qualifications are important, you know, within limits. Peace at a price. Couple of examples of tolerance. We could class them as moral and religious. Morally, the Roman Empire seemed to tolerate a lot of practices that would be considered today immoral. Abortion was widely practiced. Infanticide, you don't want your kid, you just leave them out to die, sort of thing. In fact, one of the reasons why sociologists, historians think Christianity grew so fast is that Christianity, not just because of demographics, the younger had more kids, et cetera, but also because they would take in abandoned children. They would protest against, talk people out of having abortions, those sorts of things. They practiced a kind of care for people that the culture didn't care about. So again, abortion, infanticide, homosexuality of a particular form called pederasty. In the Greco-Roman world, homosexuality was widely accepted, and it refers to the relationship between older men and younger boys. This is the kind of relationship that Plato valorizes, and this is what the Platonic relationship originally meant, a relationship both intellectual and moral and sexual between older men and younger boys. The main purpose, or the official purpose behind this practice was, in essence, a kind of mentoring relationship in which the older man would help raise this younger boy into the roles and responsibilities of society. Again, there was a sexual component to it. But that's what at least the proponents of it talk about. This is when the ancient world is talking about, the Greco-Roman world is talking about, when the New Testament writers are talking about homosexuality, if they are. It's not always clear that they are, for reasons we'll talk about when we get to this text. This is what they would have done. This is a very different way of understanding homosexuality than what we do today. We talk about sexual orientation, don't we? No, I mean, older men who are in relationships with younger boys would also have at least one wife, maybe more. They might have, right, we would today probably call them bisexual. Right? It's a very different way of construing relationships, understanding sexual orientation, the idea that two people of the same sex could love each other and be in committed monogamous relationships would have struck me as absolutely bizarre and just does not compute. Probably the same way that some of you are thinking right now, this makes absolutely no sense at all to me. Okay, a couple of people are, right? Maybe this is a good reminder, again, a text without a context is a pretext. What we mean by a term today, or what we mean by a cluster of behaviors today, is not necessarily how those things were understood a few thousand years ago, a couple thousand years ago. Conceptions, ideas change. Until, what, 30 years ago, homosexuality was considered to be a mental illness. Now, whether these conceptions should change or not, what's right, what's wrong, those are other debates. But the historical fact is cultures construe things in different ways in different centuries. And if we're not careful, when we read the New Testament, we'll be reading back into the text what's not there. Make sense? Okay. And if we did pay attention to what's there, we might save ourselves a whole lot of grief in debates and arguments that we have. But what we would today consider a morally tolerant society, certain forms of homosexuality or homosexual behavior, right, abortion, that sort of thing. Also religiously pluralistic, and I'm going to mention 4 religious groups. There were the Greco-Roman religions. These are the religious traditions and stories that the Romans sort of globbed over from the Greeks. So, right, Zeus becomes Jupiter, right? So a lot of those myths and stories. Judaism is a recognized religion in the ancient world. Christianity is not at first. It's considered to be just another version of Judaism. The emperor cult is another one that plays a role, at least in some parts of the New Testament. Cult in this sense, in a technical sense, in religious studies, cult means worship. Right? It doesn't mean strange friend groups that's out to try to brainwash your kids or something like that. Cult simply refers, in this case, to the worship of the emperor. Sometimes Roman emperors claim to be divine, sometimes the Senate might designate them as divine, but the idea was that in the Roman Empire, you might be asked to say a prayer for an emperor, burn some incense for an emperor. Right? It wasn't a terribly organized sort of thing, but the emperor was treated as a god, as divine, and some sort of loyalty or show of loyalty was required of that. Now, can you imagine how Jews and Christians would have thought, what they would have thought? Yeah. Emperor divine? Ha! In fact, when we get to Luke's gospel, we'll see that Jesus takes on a lot of the titles that were attributed to Emperor Augustus, Prince of Peace, those sorts of things. Luke's making a very strong political statement. It's not Augustus, it's Jesus. He used very political language to describe those things. And at different points in time, this became an issue. It's probably an issue lurking behind the book of Revelation in the New Testament. The emperor cult could be enforced less stringently or more stringently at different periods of time, different parts of the Roman Empire, but it's part of the background that does have an influence on the New Testament writings. And then there are the mystery religions, sort of secret societies. This is not a good analog, but maybe it's a reasonable enough one. Right? Think of different Shriner groups today. Right? You don't know what it is to be a part of that organization, the Masons or whatever, unless you're part of it. Right? It's all a mystery to the rest of us. The mystery religions in the Greco-Roman world were something like those sort of secret societies. If you didn't know, if you weren't a member of it, you didn't know what was going on. And there were multiple of these mystery religions. Probably a lot of early Christian converts came out of them, just as they would have come out of this whole mix of things. But for our purposes, 3 are particularly interesting. One mystery religion was devoted to the worship of Dionysius, or Bacchus, god of fertility. And we know some of this stuff about it because records, writings have survived and folks have studied them. But according to some of the myths, Dionysius, this fertility god, died and was raised from the dead by his father, in the Greek version. A god who dies and is raised by his father. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yeah. There's another one that comes out of Persia. Modern day Iraq and Iran. Worship of Mithras. Mithras was considered to be the giver of life, god of light. He was said by our calendar to have been born on December 25th. The third one that's interesting is worship of Isis, a mother goddess. Who promises her followers eternal life. I will confess I've cherry-picked these three and these themes to make a point. That the New Testament is written in a world in which these kinds of ideas about divine beings who die and were raised from the dead, etc., are not strange or fantastic ideas. People in the ancient world would not necessarily have thought these sorts of things as odd. Now, you can be really cynical about this. These places where Christian thought and mystery religions at least intersect, if not converge, you can be really cynical about it. You think, oh, well, the Christians just made this stuff up. They borrowed, picked and choose what they wanted to. Probably not. Probably what happened is some of the earliest Christian converts were coming out of these religious traditions. And as they learned from other folks why Jesus was important, some of the things Jesus said, Jesus did, they started drawing some parallels. Oh, that sounds a little bit like. And so these sort of affinities develop over time as, in some ways, as a rhetorical strategy. Or maybe there are some Christians are trying to show why folks who worship Dionysius should pay attention to Jesus instead. Right? Those sorts of things. So it's a religiously plural world. Lots of different religious beliefs are tolerated within limits. Questions or comments about that? It's also philosophically tolerant. Again, multiple schools of philosophical thought, but I'm going to highlight three. Platonism, really by this point in time almost a kind of Neoplatonic version, but who in here has read Plato's analogy of the cave somewhere along the way? Okay, help me out here, make sure I don't get it wrong. Right? In Plato's analogy of the cave, he asked us to imagine ourselves as prisoners inside a cave. Right? And we're facing the back wall of the cave. Behind us is the entrance, and between us and the entrance is a fire. Right? So we see our shadows projected onto the back wall of the cave. Right? One of us escapes, get outside, we see the sun and the sky and everything, and all of a sudden we realize, oh, there's something really real out here. Not the shadows in the cave. There's something of substance out here. What that analogy gets at for Plato is a kind of dualism and Plato's followers. It sets up a dualism between the ideal and images, or later on, as these ideas evolve, as ideas do, the spiritual and the physical. Right. Going back to the cave, what's real? Is it the shadows we see in the cave? No, it's the stuff outside. The ideal, or sometimes the ideas, are the only thing that are really real. Everything else is just image or appearance. What's really important? The spiritual. Physical world? Yeah. Or later on, what's the point of it all? Get to heaven. This world really doesn't matter. Remember Borg's afterlife orientation? Like that sort of thing. So, Platonic thought leaves Christianity with this dualism. That somehow the spiritual is more important, purer than the physical. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, I mean, Paul will talk this way sometimes when he'll talk about how he'd rather be with God than exist in the body, or how he's at war within himself for various sorts of things. Paul is too good a Jew to be a real dualist, but there are certainly dualistic threads within Paul that folks will interpret in this harsh dualistic way. But do you get the distinction? Okay. I confess I'm an Aristotelian. Plato doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I know what Aristotle thinks. I read Plato's dialogues. I haven't got the foggiest idea what Plato thinks, because all he's ever doing is asking questions. Right? I'm never sure which character in the dialogue is supposed to be Plato's voice. My philosopher friends who are more expert on Plato than I am said that's precisely Plato's point. Ask questions. Don't worry about the answers. Anyway, but that's part of the legacy of Plato, is this notion of dualism and how it plays out with the suspicion of this world, this life, physical stuff. The Stoics give us a couple of things. One is they give us the term logos. So in the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Logos. John is unashamedly, brashly, whoever wrote John, is unashamedly, brashly borrowing, stealing from the Stoics. The Logos refers to, we can think of it, logic. It can be word, it can be logic, those sorts of things. For the Stoics, the Logos was, in essence, the logic of the universe. It was the structure of the universe. For the Stoics, the universe was logical, it was orderly, it was rational, it was predictable. By the way, this is the basic assumption of modern science, isn't it? The world is orderly, it's predictable. We may haven't figured it all out yet, but there's an underlying structure there, and we are capable of figuring it out. If we learn how to manipulate stuff right, use the scientific method correctly, replicate the experiments a number of times without fudging the data, that sort of thing. Right? So the Stoics give us this idea of logos, a rational, orderly structure to the universe that we can figure out. And because the universe has a logical, orderly, rational structure, we should live in accord with it. So the moral task for the Stoics is to live in accord with nature. So there's some of the first people that talked about that. And, the passions, emotions disrupt us. Our highest nature is our powers for rationality and thought. That's the nature we really want to feed and foster. The Stoics also are some of the earliest critics of pederasty. And when Paul, again, if Paul's talking about homosexuality at certain points in the New Testament, only about 3 or 4 of them, there are times he seems to echo the Stoic criticism of pederasty, which is that it's unnatural. The Stoics give us that argument today. Except, again, the text without a context is pretext. What they meant by natural is not what we mean by natural today. So, if you hear somebody make the argument today, homosexuality is not natural, what do people today mean by that? Yeah, biological nature, right? Sex is for procreation. They're all good Roman Catholics at this point, right? Sex is for procreation. Well, two people of the same gender cannot procreate. It's unnatural, right? The plumbing isn't put together that way. Okay? That's what we tend to mean. It's biological nature and very much procreation oriented. What they meant by unnatural was it's unnatural for a man to take the passive receptive position in the sex act. A lot of gender stereotypes going on. Women, you all don't look good in the ancient world. Well, I mean, you might look good, but you're still second-class citizens, right? Aristotle says that women are misbegotten males. Something goes wrong in utero, and what should have started off as a boy turns into a woman. A lot of sexism in the ancient world. Again, going back to Borg, it's a patriarchal world, patriarchal society. So, you know, women are supposed to be passive, women are supposed to be submissive, women are supposed to be receptive, those sorts of things. And a lot of gender stereotypes, social role stereotyping going on, at least from our perspective. But that's what the Stoics give us and how they become relevant at different points in the story of the New Testament. Make sense? Questions? Then there are the Cynics. The Cynics were itinerant, wandering teachers. They were ascetics in the sense that they largely gave up on the acquisition of material goods. In fact, they tended to be critical of people who, well, a lot of movements in the ancient world were critical of people who devoted their lives to the acquisition of material goods. They were, again, itinerant, they were wanderers, and they were, in things, social critics, critical of political, economic, and religious elites. New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan has written a book called Jesus, the Revolutionary, in which he tries to make the case that what Jesus was a Jewish version of a first century cynic. Itinerant person who wandered around Judea, Galilee, Samaria. He criticized political, economic, and religious elites. Seems to have lived, at least by some accounts, an ascetic life, although he got a reputation for in some New Testament texts as being the life of party. So, it's an interesting group. But again, the idea that there is a subculture of social criticism going on that Jesus in some ways seems to parallel. Again, some of the positives. Peace, technology, rule of law, tolerance, in all these different ways. But the good side comes at a price. And that's the use of military force, violence. One author describes the Pax Romana and the cost of the Pax Romana in this way. It was the central tenet of Roman propaganda, whose slogan of peace and security argued that the benefits of imperial rule were more valuable to conquered peoples than their freedom and independent rule. Now, if you were one of the subjected people in the Roman Empire, you probably didn't agree with that, but that was the Roman propaganda. It's better to live under our thumb than to be independent. Unlike the modern classification of peace and war as opposites, the Pax Romana was ironically closely connected to warfare and the development of a permanent standing Roman army. It is impossible to ignore the reality that this peace was established through warfare and conquest and maintained not through the absence of violence, but through the exercise or threat of it. Thus, violence at its most basic definition of intentional physical injury was an undercurrent of daily life for many residents of the Roman Empire, including the authors and earliest audiences of the New Testament. Okay? It's peace at a price. It's a point of a sword. You do what I say, you'll be fine. You don't? Well, tough. The Romans didn't develop crucifixion, but they developed it and used it in a very, very effective way. It's probably one of the most inhumane forms of capital punishment ever devised, in which people who are hanging up on the cross basically suffocate to death over time, because the way you're hoisted up on the cross, you can't breathe easily. So you might hang on a cross for days before you die. And then after you die, your body might be left up there for days as a reminder for everybody who walks by, this is what happens to you when you cross the Roman Empire. Jesus was crucified. In the Roman Empire, you don't get crucified unless somehow you threaten the established order. Runaway slaves, insurgents, those are the people who get crucified. Jesus didn't get crucified because his message was, oh, I just want us all to hold hands, sing Kumbaya, and let's all get along with one another. You know, he got crucified because he threatened powerful people. And that's, you know, crucifixion, capital punishment as a form of terrorism, as a form of population control, is right in line with the violence of the Roman Empire. Whatever romanticized notions of the Pax Romana, whatever benefits may have come out of it, the use of violent force to produce it should make us wonder about whether the so-called peace was worth the price. But you know, you just don't cross the Roman Empire. Spit into the wind, pull the mask off the old room preacher, or mess around the jet. Anybody remember old songs? It's also a domination society in terms that Borg defines. And I'll let you reread the passages out of Borg that I assigned that talk about this. But basically, a domination society is where one small class of people dominates the society politically, economically, and other ways. Right? In the ancient world, there's virtually no middle class. There's a very small elite that own most of the wealth, and a very large lower class. You know, some of the statistics you read about the distribution of wealth today in the United States, I mean, it's not quite domination system status, but the way wealth is concentrated at the top, you know, with the distance here, should give us pause. You know, when CEOs make, what's the latest stat, something like 400 or 500 times more than the average worker in the company, something's wrong somewhere. From this sort of perspective, sets up this domination system. The people at the bottom, average citizen, has no control over the decisions that affect their lives. They're completely shut out politically as well as economically. And it's all authorized, legitimized by religion. Oh, this is the way God wants it to be. God wants some people to be rich, God wants some people to be poor, and if you give enough money to my ministry, I will make sure you're with them. That's something else. But it's this idea, again, be familiar with Borg on the domination side. That's the Roman Empire, like most ancient empires. It's also an honor-shame culture. It's an agonistic society. Agon is a Greek word meaning gain. In some sense, life, at least for free males, is a game. It's a sport. If you win the games, what do you get? Prize, honor. If you lose, well, in the Roman Empire, you could get death. But you know, you should be ashamed of yourself. Right? In the ancient world, ancient Roman Empire, you could gain honor in multiple ways: by the amount of stuff you gathered, by the number of women you bedded. Again, this is all pretty much men that count here. You know, like when you tell good jokes at a party, are you a good orator? That's a way of gaining honor. And if you're a lousy public speaker, well, you should be ashamed of yourself. Right? Honor, shame, authority, submission. You gain honor by having more servants, more people submit to you. than other people do. Think of the phrase, person who has the most toys wins. Something like that. This is part of the culture. Okay? An ethic of domination and submission. All right. In a nutshell, those are some of the key features of the Roman Empire. The Dominion Society, honor, shame stuff we'll come back to, and it becomes particularly relevant when we get to Ephesians and talking about gender relationships there. Because what Ephesians does is try to undercut, probably too subtly for its own good, but undercut that. Okay, the Jewish context. We'll get started on this. A couple of things to note about the Jewish context is the sense of religious identity. Jewish people trace their origins back at least to Abraham. Genesis 12, God calls Abraham, makes a promise to Abraham, and so there's this sense that out of all the people of the universe, God has chosen this person, Abraham, and Abraham's descendants to be God's people. So there's a sense of chosenness, not necessarily for privilege, because if you read that story correctly, if you read it closely, it's also a story of responsibility. Yeah, Abraham's going to be blessed, but he's supposed to bless the world, and his descendants are supposed to bless the world. So it's chosen to serve. That often has gotten supported, and most people who think that they're chosen people tend to forget there's a responsibility that goes alongside that. But there's a sense of being chosen by God. Right? Being delivered by God out of Egypt during the Exodus, all this stuff tends to reinforce that. Being delivered from exile later in history. Right? God is if not on our side, at least we have this special relationship with God. But it's also included a history of domination. Going back to ancient Israel. What had been this ancient nation of Israel really only existed for maybe 100, 150, 200 years, not even that long. Maybe even just about 100 years. I have to go back and look at the chronology. Anyway, when Solomon dies, what was ancient Israel splits into two nations, Israel and Judah. In 722 BCE, the nation of Israel is wiped off the earth by the Assyrian Empire. 587 BCE, Babylon takes Judah into captivity. There is no independent Israel from about 587 BCE until the modern nation of Israel is established in 1948.
Is that when they marched around like with the horn for 7 days?
That was prior to the nation of Israel. Yeah. So, there's this history of domination. Yes, we're God's chosen people, but we've never had a nation, or only for a brief period of time. There's been this history of domination by other empires, whether it's Egypt, Syria, Babylon, followed by Persia, Greece, Rome. So this idea of a Jewish state seems, in the first century, an independent Jewish nation is something like wishful thinking. But we'll see how that plays out when we look at messianic expectations. The term Messiah literally means anointed one. It was used initially, it grows out of the practice of crowning Jewish kings. According to biblical texts, Samuel anoints Saul with oil, Samuel anoints David with oil. Anointed one, somebody that God has chosen for a task. That idea morphs and changes over time, and we'll pick that up there on Wednesday. Okay? All right. Even though we're running a little behind, keep up with the reading, and well, hopefully this helps make a little more sense of it. I want the reading to supplement, fill in the gaps in some of the details. No, the quizzes will just be clear on what was assigned and what was